here. Thank you for joining.
Thank
we
you.
are thrilled to host today's first Instagram Live. This Instagram Live is being hosted by the Society for Women's Health Research, or SWHR. For those who aren't familiar with us, SWHR is a more than 30-year-old national nonprofit dedicated to promoting research on biological sex differences in disease and improving women's health through science, policy, and education. Over the past year, SWHR has been engaged in a program to explore the federal policy landscape surrounding supporting women with autoimmune diseases and conditions. And as part of that program, we have held a series of public forums to discuss different issues within this space. And today's discussion is part of that. The topic of today's live is a critically important one, generally speaking, but it's also very important for our ability to support those living with autoimmune diseases and conditions. And that topic is of diversity within clinical trials. So I'm joined today by several experts in this space to share why having diversity within trials is important, how people can participate in clinical trials and why they may want to, and the importance of having diverse research leaders. And so those speakers are with me today. Dr. Stacy Bell. Stacy is the Executive Vice President of Lupus Therapeutics. She is a leader and researcher with more than 25 years of experience in a wide range of disciplines related to discovery research, drug and device development, and medical affairs. Dr. Nidhi Goel is the Senior Vice President and Therapeutic Head of Rheumatology at TrialSpark and is an adjunct professor of medicine at Duke University School of Medicine. Dr. Jessica Williams, our other scheduled speaker, couldn't be here today, but we are thrilled that Dr. Carla Booten Foster was able to join us, and she is the Associate Dean for Diversity, Education, and Research and a Professor of Clinical Medicine at Downstate Health and Sciences University. So welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for lending your time and expertise to this conversation and for joining us for our first live. So kind of to get us started, I would love to just do a quick bit of level setting for those who may be newer to this topic or just not as familiar. So maybe, Nidhi, I will start with you. Can you just start us off? What is an autoimmune disease?
Yeah, so the typical way I explain this to my patients is that an autoimmune disease, if you think of a cut and the cut gets all red around it and, you know, and you force a scab, is basically your immune system or your body trying to make sure that you don't get infected, that you can fight off an infection, and that you can protect yourself. When you develop an autoimmune disease, of course, that system gets turned on to fight yourself or parts of yourself as if you were an infection. And so it's basically that, you know, your system is turned on in the wrong way, and we're trying to figure out, you know, multiple medications depending on disease to try to treat that. But unfortunately, when you treat autoimmune, often the side effect is that you are still suppressing your system, and so you end up being more likely to get infection, because if you're turning it off to fight yourself, you're now also turning it off to fight infections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a great summary. And next kind of level setting question, and Carla, maybe I'll turn this over to you, but Stacy, if you want to tack on anything, please feel free to. So throughout this discussion, we'll be referring to diversity in terms of clinical trial participants. What does it mean when we refer to diversity in this context? What kind of things could that entail?
That is such an important question. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about representation, diverse, different representations in terms of race, ethnicity, nativity, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, socioeconomic status, and geography. Because these different spheres of identity will lead to different outcomes in patients and the different experiences. So we really have to understand the social context of a disease and the social context in which clinical trials occur. So diversity brings different perspectives and experiences to the table and allows us to really grow as a science and to really increase the generalizability of our therapeutic and diagnostic discoveries.
Thank you.
Excellent, Carla. Thank you. I think, the other thing is that oftentimes individuals think about diversity maybe just within our patient population or within a specific study. And really that diversity is important as in consideration for health equity across the board and access to healthcare. So
Absolutely.
it's our researchers, it's our diversity considerations and policy, it is research and education. And so whether that be, you know, instructors, researchers, clinical trialists, that diversity needs to be represented throughout. And I'll talk more of this in a little bit, and as will Carla and Nidhi, as far as the importance to have diversity within our clinicians and our research community as well. But, you know, we need individuals participating in research that see others that look like themselves. And we also need those voices heard that may not be typically heard. So whether that's from underserved populations, rural communities like me coming from rural North Dakota, all those elements really come into play.
Great. And then kind of the last question I'll ask on this kind of starting point is, one of the reasons SWHR is engaged in this space is because autoimmune diseases disproportionately affect women. I think it's close to 80% of those that are diagnosed with autoimmune diseases and conditions are women. So there's clearly a great disparity here, but women have not always been included within clinical trials. And, you know, why is that, Nidhi? How is it, and how has that affected our understanding of autoimmune diseases and conditions as we see them now?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I think a lot of it has been due to the fact that hormones, people wanted to exclude, quote unquote, the effect of hormones in it. I think too, you know, Stacey alluded before, it's the people who look at me. So, you know, in the past, many of our physicians were white men. And so, you know, that may have also impacted the level of engagement to recruit women in clinical trials. It wasn't that they were necessarily, especially in later stage clinical trials, phase 2, phase 3, excluded, but they may not have gravitated towards wanting to be, you know, enrolled because of their relationship with another physician. So I think that those are things. I'm happy to report that, you know, we are increasing in diversity in terms of people who look like me, but also women. At least 50% of the women enrolling in med school these days, or people enrolling in med school these days are male. At least in terms of sex, maybe not in terms of gender. But, you know, I think that that's a great stride, and we have seen increasing numbers of women in clinical trials. It's important because, you know, I actually am also a patient living with psoriatic arthritis. I speak broadly on that, but we've seen that psoriatic arthritis trials in terms of diversity, in terms of race, is poorly represented, but we are also now doing a shout out to Leahy Eater at University of Toronto, who's doing the SAGE study, looking at specifically differences in outcomes in women versus men with psoriatic arthritis or psoriatic disease. And I think that that's really crucial because early data point to women having worse outcomes than men for various reasons in that. And you know, Stacey works with the Lupus Foundation. This is also very well known. That's actually 90% women. Many of them are reproductive age. It's incredibly important to understand their disease process, how it also affect their childbearing potential, because it's still something many women want to do, is be a mother.
So let's dive into this a little bit more. We've already started to touch on several of these key points through Carla and Nidhi and Stacey, your previous answers, but why having diversity within autoimmune clinical trials is important. You started to touch on the hormones that impact women. Different bodies metabolize things differently. What are some of the specifics here? How might medications respond differently in different bodies? And maybe Stacey, I'll start with you, and then I'll open it up to the other panelists. And please feel free to tack on anything additional that you haven't addressed already.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start off. You know, I think that the first thing really to think about with autoimmune disease, and I think anyone who's participating and listening today can comment on this as well, each experience is so different. So even, you know, Nidhi commented on her experience and journey with psoriatic arthritis. The next person that has psoriatic arthritis may have different experiences with that. And there are many factors. We've already touched on things like sex and gender and age and geographic location, socioeconomic status. But there are also autoimmune diseases are just very heterogeneous. And, looking at my current community of the lupus community, each person experiences and lives with lupus in a different way. So when we think about diversity within a clinical trial, we also need to take a cross section that represents all of those individuals that are experiencing their disease in that particular manner. You touched on already, Lindsay, as far as autoimmune diseases being disproportionately centered on women. That right there is a case where we didn't have that representation necessarily in trials before, as Needy just mentioned. The other interesting thing, and again, I'll speak specifically to lupus, but this is true with a number of autoimmune conditions, as there's also, disproportionate representation in different races and ages as well. And so within lupus, individuals of color are 2 to 3 times more likely to develop lupus and also to develop more severe lupus. So, why is that? And looking at those differences within the context of our clinical trials, it's very important. So, going back to the psoriatic disease community, a lot of the initial psoriasis trials were done in Caucasian and white populations because psoriasis was characterized as this red plaque-like raised rash with silvery scales. Well, that isn't the presentation in many other skin types. So, that's changed, and thankfully, as Needy alluded to, that's evolved. But we need to do that with all of the disease states and make sure that we're truly evaluating the population impacted by the disease to have the best treatments for that population.
Needy, Carla, anything that you'd like to tack on?
No, I think what Stacey said is absolutely correct, and it's the presentation of disease that may differ by sex, as well as the symptoms. So unless we have diversity in clinical trials and representation, we'll miss opportunities to intervene because we're looking for a characteristic rash that appears different on skin of color, a cardiovascular manifestation of a rheumatologic condition, and we're expecting it to be crushing chest pain, and it's not. It may be fatigue or discomfort in a woman. So as scientists, we really need to understand the different representation, the different presentation of illness and conditions based on biology. And it's really important that, the NIH is really, they're very rigorous when it comes to sex as a biological variable. So if a clinical trial is proposed and it does not have sex as a biological variable, in other words, the researchers are not looking at potential sex differences, then that question is raised. So this is so important to really advance the science and the therapeutic options.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Agree with everything that was said. I at this point, I have nothing to add. I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but there's other questions that we would love to tackle.
Yeah, and Needy, I want to actually pick up on something that you alluded to in one of your earlier comments. So whenever we think about diversity, part of that is including pregnant and lactating populations in research. That's a critically important one, especially as autoimmune diseases and conditions disproportionately impact women. So why should this population be included in research studies, and why?
Yeah, I think actually it's really funny because I was reading an article in one of our magazines, Rheumatology, and she's actually a pregnancy expert at Duke who worked in the area extensively, and it was funny because she's saying, there's 2 people in the registry that have had this drug when we've used this drug in thousands normally, and she's intrigued by the data but doesn't have enough to make recommendations. Or some of the traditional medications we might use, for example, if we talked about arthritis, that the data show that the endpoints are at 2 months or 2 years, but the outcomes at 6 months are not that convincing. And so then if you're talking about no one's pregnant for 2 years. So if you're waiting for a drug to wait for 2 years to try pregnancy outcome, then that's problematic. And so I also think about it in terms of many of our patients who have autoimmune disease are of childbearing potential, and they don't want that immune disease to impact their ability to be a mom. And so, or even to be a surrogate for that matter. And so that all said and done, I mean, many, many years ago now, we've the FDA, for example, put into place aspects that encourage pediatric drug development because they were also a very diverse population in terms of data. And much of the data that we have related to pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes are based on animal data for the drugs. And so, we do have registries. The Otis registry is one that I'm very familiar with and, would refer patients to. But I think that, our government could do more like they did for the pediatric population to encourage development and encourage sponsors to do drug development in pregnancy and lactation, similar to, like I said, for a pediatric.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I recognize we have limited time, and I want to use you all for get you all for as many questions as possible. So maybe switching gears a little bit and thinking about participating in autoimmune clinical trials. We may have some individuals on this call who have an autoimmune disease or condition, and, they say to themselves, I want to support the research process. What can I do? So Carla, maybe to you, if you were somebody who has an autoimmune disease or a condition and you're interested in seeing if you may be eligible for a clinical trial, where can you go to learn more? Who should you talk to?
Well, that's another great question, and it's specific because of the heterogeneity of autoimmune diseases. It depends on the condition itself. So you may go to the specialty organization. Lupus Research Alliance, for instance, has on their website, and Stacey can talk more about that. The PALS program, it's patient advocates for lupus studies that you can learn about clinical trials, and then just clinicaltrials.gov has mainly all trials that are open, and you can go in. The trial is it an open trial? Is a trial that's for open enrollment? Where is the trial being held, and what condition, and what are the criteria? And then they will link you to coordinators or the investigators for that for that condition.
Yeah, and I'll add, just as an add-on, for lupus, particularly with Lupus Research Alliance and Lupus Therapeutics, we not only have links to just potential studies on our website and resources available there. We also have programs like PALS that Carla mentioned, Project Change, where we're actually trying to bring community-based research forward so that we're informing communities, surrounding some of our network sites for lupus clinical trials so that they can actively be involved. But, as a patient, you all need to be your best advocates, myself included, and I think all of us that have conditions. I would encourage you to speak to your healthcare providers. They'll have resources available. There's a number of other, in other therapeutic areas, the National Psoriasis Foundation for psoriasis, the list could go on. And I think that that's something that you can ask your healthcare provider about as well, if there are resources available. Now, Google is so powerful. You can search and find out a great deal about, your particular lived experience and potentially ways that you could be involved in trials as well.
I would also give a shout out to registries. I mean, some people don't have time
Good point.
to go to a site. And yes, there are increasingly some studies that can be conducted in the home. But
Sure.
when they're available, registries still are an important provision of data for the practitioner to help make healthcare decisions. And so, for example, it's now called the Forward Data, but the National Data Bank of Rheumatic Diseases is a way that you can just sign up to provide data on if you have an autoimmune musculoskeletal condition, that they will also collect your data. And it's a way to participate in virtual research if you don't have time to do something else. So the one addition I would also suggest is potentially if you have an academic medical center going near you, that you could look at the academic medical center website if they have any clinical trials available. That also helps you know that there's one near you versus you go to trials.gov. You have to look by state, see if the zip codes matches up for you, et cetera, et cetera. But all of that would be another suggestion I would have to a study near yourself.
I think the other thing too that's important to remember is if you have an interest in participating in biomedical research or a clinical trial, it isn't necessarily just an interventional trial where you're having a new therapy or something that you may feel less comfortable participating in. There's many ways that you can participate, whether that even be through sharing your experience, through conversation. Many activities I know now within the lupus community, we're about to embark on the Lupus Nexus, where it's actually a biospecimen repository. You can be giving some of your, a small sample of your blood or urine or whatever that may be, and how that informs a community can not only benefit you and your potential treatment plans down the road, but those around you, your peers, and supporting your community in that manner. So, I would also encourage everyone to be open to the various types of trials and research that are ongoing, and that there's ways that you could help and be involved without maybe having to take a new medication that you may be more reluctant to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's such an important point, and great points raised throughout this answer. One of the other things I want to discuss a little bit, and I would love each of your thoughts on this. So whenever we talk about diversity in clinical trials, one of the things that comes up quite a bit is this idea of mistrust in clinical trials. And curious, I think we have heard there are a few different schools of thought. Some say it's not so much that there's mistrust anymore, it's just that the right populations aren't being asked to participate. So I think that's, first and foremost, the most critical thing. But do you think that mistrust still exists within this space? And if so, what are the things that you would say to encourage people to participate and why they should consider participating in clinical trials?
No, if I may start, I think mistrust is a very important aspect, especially for communities that have been marginalized and minoritized and excluded from medicine. So it's critically important to have that in mind. And for someone who's interested in clinical trials, one of the things is to go to the people that they do trust, if their provider, to talk to the provider and find out, is this appropriate for me? Also talk to people who have participated in clinical trials or who are living with the condition and find out what their experiences have been. So recognizing that mistrust is important, but it's also bidirectional, that as researchers and scientists, we really have to be proactive, engage in settings where the very group and population you're trying to enroll may find networks, whether it's faith-based organizations or schools or other non-clinical settings. It's really important. So as researchers, we really have to be in the community where things are happening and before we try to enroll someone in our clinical doors. So clinical engagement, which is a really big aspect of Project Change, is so important. And that's how you develop trust. You can't gain trust by the first time you go to enroll someone. It's the first time they're hearing about you or they're seeing you. So academic institutions, I think Needy mentioned that, going to the academic institutions that are within your local region. As academicians, we need to go out there also. So, trust is bidirectional. We really have to work for it. It's not something that we should just expect to happen.
Absolutely.
And if I could add to that, some of the diversity aspects are, culturally, some people may depend more on their community to give them the go to participate in the studies. So, to cover discussion related to going to a faith-based organization or the senior center or the community club, whatever it might be, that where people tend to gather, where they feel they're with other people that they trust, speaking to them, developing advocacy in that sense for the clinical trial can also be incredibly important in building the trust that Carla alluded to.
And then what do you all see as the greatest barriers to people participating in clinical trials? Are there barriers that potentially federal policies could seek to change or improve?
If I could take that question, or I think some of the barriers just exist with the existing clinical trial infrastructure. We're talking about a therapeutic drug trial or an investigation product. Many of the investigators are investigators that have always been there. And so then they're also recruiting from the populations from which they always recruited. And if we're not developing the next generation of investigators, settings, and where we can recruit more diverse populations, that becomes problematic. I think the other barrier is just things like time, and or remuneration and or childcare. Those are all great barriers in terms of people being able to participate. If you're working jobs and you have 2 kids at home, you can imagine there's not a lot of time. You don't have maybe a weekend set of hours to see patients in, or evening hours in which to see patients for clinical trials. That's also going to greatly reduce the ability. I think that, with COVID, the shift to home, more things being able to be done at home, but the infrastructure is still not complete there. There are some barriers to practice of medicine that don't facilitate that. It's also still an expensive endeavor. And so the more likely that that becomes a possibility to execute upon clinical trials, I think that those will also help encourage participation.
And I think also looking at some of the patient populations, if you would like a lot of women to participate, and especially women of childbearing potential or that may have young children, considering daycare, considerations for those individuals. I think that it goes to the trial design, and that goes to academic centers that may be involved in assisting with the trial design. It goes to the pharmaceutical sponsors that are looking at trial design. I think as Needy mentioned, clinical trials have evolved, and I think those designs need to evolve with them. You asked, though, about federal policy, and I think there are a couple of important elements here. One of the really important factors that happened recently is the FDA coming forward and actually taking a stance to encourage but mandate diversity in clinical trials, and really outlining a roadmap on how to do that in years to come. But they also need to then work in partnership with patients and with developers of these treatments to ensure that approvals can happen with evolved clinical trial design as well. And so I think things like yesterday's announcement for the Lupus Research Alliance entering into a public-private partnership with the FDA, things like that are going to be critical to ensure that not only diversity is considered within clinical trials, but outcome measures, patient-reported outcomes, et cetera, are appropriate and applicable to make the impacts they need to make within the patient community.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you all so much. And before we close out, Stacey, at the top of the call, you were talking about it's not enough to just have a diversity of patients within clinical trials. You also need to have diverse leadership and diverse researchers leading these investigations. So would love to ask, and maybe Carla, we can start with you. Stacey, Needy, of course, please add on. But why is it also important to have diverse research leaders and investigators?
Oh, that's another great question. Having diverse research leaders and investigators brings additional scientific and clinical perspectives to the table. So their lived experiences may move the clinical trial to look at other questions, to look at barriers potential. It may introduce, again, the social context in which people live and in which disease manifests or progresses. It's going to raise attention to non-clinical factors, bring to the table social determinants of health. So if you have clinical trial leaders who do not worry about food, who do not experience food insecurity or housing insecurity, then when that comes up in the context of a clinical trial as a barrier to enrollment, we won't have solutions because it wasn't thought at the forefront. So diversity really, it enhances clinical trials because you start to put in place solutions to mitigate potential problems. But if they're not considered, then we're always, we're not moving forward. So it really enhances the clinical trials, clinical trial design, recruitment, retention of a clinical trial, and it really grows the research enterprise.
Anything else either of you would like to add on?
I completely agree with everything that was said.
Yeah. I think it also goes back to those individuals integrating into their communities, right? And being aware of their patient population. I always think back when I worked in the nutritional space and really being a biochemist and a clinical pharmacologist by training, nutrition comes up in almost every therapeutic area. And it was always easy for an individual that was unaware of the community or their surroundings, or because maybe they didn't experience, to say, well, eat kale or eat passion fruit. Both of those are healthy for you, and them not only being out of touch with that food insecurity may be an issue, but also that culturally that those things may not be appropriate to the individuals that they're speaking to or available to them. And so I really think that having that diversity across the board also gives a grounding or a foundation in how they make their decisions, how they interact with their patients, but also how they participate in research. And everyone on this call has heard me say many times about the rural population when diversity comes up, because I experienced that on a day-to-day basis growing up. Similarly to the experiences that Nidhi and Carla may be able to comment to, being a woman of color, going through their upbringing and through their medical training. And so I think that all those elements really need to be considered when we're thinking about diversity, so that we're holistically trying to improve.
I like that word, holistic. Really, it's really looking at science holistically.
Such an important point.
Yeah.
Oh, Nidhi, was there something you were going to add?
No, I agree. And I think, it goes back to, as I mentioned, without that diversity, if the person is really looking for someone that looks like them as part of that element of trust, then if they don't have access to that, then that also potentially disengages them from being a potential clinical participant. And so it again, Carl alluded to, so much of this is bidirectional. And so without that leadership, then you have potentially patients who don't get the access that they need because that's how they feel about it. They trust as fully as they could.
That's great. Well, it's amazing how quickly 30 minutes goes, but I think it really speaks to how much there is here to explore. And I truly think we could host so many different 30-minute conversations on Instagram Live. So I may be coming back to you all for us to be able to do part 2. But maybe before we close out today, would love to just do a quick round robin of final thoughts. SWHR's audiences are comprised of policymakers, patients and patient advocates, researchers, clinicians. And so, those groups may be reached through this conversation. What is the one thing that you want people to take away from our conversation today? And I'll go in the order that I see you all on my screen. So maybe Nidhi, I'll start with you, and then Stacy, and then we'll end with Carla.
Yeah, I think that, it goes both ways, but find a way to get involved. Find a way to contribute at some level. And there are so many ways to do that. Just try. I think, everyone can contribute at some level and find a way to contribute. It's important for everyone, and to increase the diversity of what we know and how well it applies to everyone.
Excellent. And I would add to that, collaborate. I don't care if you're a patient seeking treatment and you want to work with your healthcare providers. I don't care if it's healthcare providers trying to work with, pharmaceutical sponsors to bring new treatments forward, working with our federal agencies. Without that collaboration, we won't be able to succeed. We won't be able to improve the lives of those living with autoimmune conditions. And along with that collaboration comes an openness to hear and to see other perspectives other than your own. And I think that that's the thing, that the charge that I would say is, take notice of those around you, and really be mindful in your actions at whatever level you are. And if you're a patient, think about the peers that are living with your autoimmune condition as well, and how you can help them as well as yourself.
No, I agree. I'm not sure what else to add, but I agree. Sharing your stories are really important. Sharing your experiences that you've had participating in clinical trial, or even with a family member, caregivers. That's an important aspect of clinical trials, that some people may be reluctant to participate because they're the primary caregiver. So we need to engage their social support networks, because clinical trial, again, it's something that happens not only in a laboratory, it really happens in a real world setting. There's this whole social context of clinical trial and living and experiencing a condition that includes a diverse group of individuals, their patients, family members, and the community. So so engaging the community and trusted messengers in the process of creating clinical trials, and leveraging the expertise of our community members. really. Sometimes we're trying to figure out, well, why aren't we doing, go to the individuals who our community members trust. They've lived this. They have the answers. So really engaging communities equitably and leveraging the expertise that they have.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much again for contributing your time and expertise to this discussion. And thank you for testing Instagram Live with us. This was fun. I know it was an experience for all of us. But I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all for the important work that you do day in and day out. If you're interested in learning more about SWHR's autoimmune policy work, please visit our website at swhr.org. As I mentioned, this is the fourth and final conversation in our public forum series, but we also have several policy briefs on this topic as well as a policy agenda available. So would encourage you to check out those resources. And thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to staying in touch and continuing this work with you moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you.
Take care.